On our last installment of Banned Throughout the Ages, we finished covering the July 2002 Forbidden and Limited list. On that list, we saw the semi-limitation of 3 cards, those being Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, and Heavy Storm. We also saw the limitation of 1 card, that being Mirror Force. We now continue our venture throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh's Forbidden and Limited list, progressively covering every single ban list till we reach the most recent one. I'll be your host, Topsy Turnip, and this is Banned Throughout the Ages. Prior to the release of the next ban list, yet again we had another main set be introduced to the game. That new set being the oh so iconic Magic Rulers, that was later renamed to Spell Rulers. While doing research for this video, I ended up realizing that little to no information could be found online about the set and the meta that emerged from it. So a lot of this video will be just speculation from my side and a retrospective look at the cards. Alright, so let's continue then. So Spell Rulers was well known for 2 reasons. One, of course, for the name change, and secondly, being the amount of very broken and overpowered spell cards that were introduced into the format. While this set does not completely revolutionize the game the way the Metal Raiders did, it does add quite a bit of power creep to the game. For the most part, that power creep came in from the spell cards that were introduced, and as far as monsters and traps are concerned, not too many impressive cards were introduced for them. But even though we didn't get all that many broken monsters and trap cards, there are still a few worth talking about. Of those monsters, the best one by a mile away was Cyberjar, an incredibly powerful flip monster that we'll discuss a bit later on. Besides Cyberjar, we also did have the Elemental Battle Recruiters be introduced, which was a series of level 4 monsters, all with 1400 attack points, that upon being destroyed by battle, would tutor out another monster of the respective attribute. We had Giant Rat for earth monsters, Mother Grizzly for water, Flying Kaminari for wind, UFO Turtle for fire, Shining Angel for lights, and finally Mystic Tomato for darks. But for the most part, these monsters weren't great on their debut, due to the fact that these attributes didn't have all that many worthwhile targets to bring out. Well, all for except maybe Mystic Tomato, that was able to bring out Witch of the Black Forest and Sangan. Aside from the battle recruiters, another monster worth mentioning is Maha Vilo, which was an interesting monster for dedicated beatdown strategies, but as far as playable monsters go, that's as far as it goes. On another note, Spell Rulers did also introduce 2 new types of mechanics into the game, those being Ritual Monsters and Toon Monsters, which were both awful. Rituals were horrendous. They required far too many resources to pull off their summon, and at that, there was little to no reward for bringing them out. Most of the Ritual Monsters in this set, with the exception of Relinquished, were all horrible vanilla monsters not worth their trouble. As far as Toons are concerned though, they weren't any better. There were 4 Toon monsters introduced in the set. Of those 4, 3 of them were tribute monsters. And on top of that, none of them actually had any effects. No, seriously, none of them do. The wall of text on them is nothing more than just restrictions and maintenance costs for them to even exist on the field. Oh, my bad, I forgot. They do have one effect, if you can even call it that. They all have the ability to attack your opponent directly, as long as you pay 500 light points. So yeah, there's that. And also, Toon World was a necessary card to be playing in the deck for them to even function. Overall, most of these monsters didn't really affect the meta all that much. As for trap cards, they were complete crap. There's maybe one worth mentioning, and that's maybe Spellbinding Circle. And even then, it's a meh card at best. Alright, now we're going to be covering the good part of the set, the spell cards. I'm going to try and speed through most of these because, well, spoiler alert, most of the ban list consists of some of these very powerful cards. Spell Rulers introduced many new nifty equip spells with varying versatility. We had equip spells that could outright win the game, some that could replace themselves or punish your opponent for destroying them. Spell Rulers also introduced new cards that could interact with your opponent's hand, with cards like Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry. New back row hate was integrated into the game with the introduction of Giant Trunade and Mystical Space Typhoon. Also, burn and stall strategies were more solidified and bolstered with cards like Gravekeeper Servant, Tall, Chain Energy, and Messenger of Peace. As you can see, Spell Rulers had a plethora of extraordinarily powerful spell cards that would inhibit the power creep of the game. Now that we've seen a brief overview of the set, let's see how the introduction of these cards affected the decisions that were made in the October 2002 ban list. This list had a grand total of 7 cards hit on it. Of those 7, 6 of them were spell cards and only 1 was a monster. Now then, let's go ahead and break down this ban list with the first card up. Cyberjar. This is a level 3 Dark Attribute Rock type Flip monster with the following effect. Flip. Destroy all monsters on the field, including this monster. Both players pick up, not draw, 5 cards from the top of their respective decks and show the cards to each other. Immediately special summon any monster cards of level 4 or lower among them on the field in face-up attack position or face-down defense position. The rest of the cards picked up are placed in the player's hand. Alright, so why was this card limited? During this period of time, flip monsters were just about the strongest type of monster you could be playing. This was due to the very powerful and versatile flip effects they possessed. Some great examples of this were cards like Magician of Faith, Man-Eater Bug, or Wall of Illusions, and Mask of Darkness. All very powerful monsters that saw consistent play and remained relevant for a good while. In order for these monsters to be balanced, flip monsters had to go through extra steps in order to get their effects off. At least that was the case until this card got printed. When taking a look at Cyberjar, it's hard to imagine what exactly they were thinking when they created such a powerful card. Keep in mind, what exactly this card accomplishes upon resolution of its effect. 1. It nukes the board just like a Dark Hole does. 2. You get to dig into your deck 5 cards deep, and then you get to special summon every monster excavated that was level 4 or lower. Oh, and how could I forget? All the cards that weren't summoned, you get to keep. So yeah, resolving Cyberjar was essentially the equivalent of a Dark Hole, at least an Upstart Goblin or better, and the effect of a Recruiter, but way better. All in all, this card could do essentially everything you could possibly ask for. So it goes to reason that this card should just have not been printed at all and deserve to be banned outright. Normally at this point I would try and play devil's advocate for the card, but it's honestly extraordinarily hard to do so. When taking into account just how ridiculous this card is, it borderline reads like a fan-made card. But what the hell, let's give it a shot. At first glance, this reads as nothing but positives for the user of it. An advantage generating machine, if you will. But this card is a lot more interesting than that. For example, board wipes are meant to solely make your opponent lose advantage, in the cases of cards like Regeki and Mirror Force. But in Cyberjar's case, both players lose all their monsters, just like Dark Hole, but there's more to it. It doesn't just get rid of both players' resources, instead it actually replenishes them by having both players acquire 5 new cards. This one caveat made it more balanced, I suppose. I say this since you might nuke the entire board and clear all your opponent's monsters off the field, but at the same time, you'll also give your opponent 5 new cards. But honestly, this was the only real downside to the card. Even then, there were so many ways to mitigate this downside. With the existence of cards like Confiscation, Delinquent Duo in the Forceful Sentry, Raigeki, and Dark Hole in the format, you could easily dictate the pace of the game. The utility of this card was unmatched, and it shows with the limitation that it received. This card could be played in a wide variety of decks, from full-on aggro to molasses slow stall decks. So I took it upon myself to test this card in a variety of different decks. To no one's surprise, this card was great in all of them, especially recruiter control decks. Instead of focusing on the aggro style decks or the control style decks, I instead want to focus on the deck that embodies the reason why this card should not have been printed at all. That deck being Stall/Mill. This egregious deck was the amalgamation of some of the most annoying cards in the format and was a pain to go up against. This deck would utilize cards like Spear Cretin to set up a soft lock where this card would just become unkillable, Magician of Faith to recover cards like Card Destruction to whittle the opponent's hand faster and deck them out, a number of recruiters depending on the build, alongside a brigade of no fun cards like Gravekeeper's Servant, Tall, Chain Energy, and Messenger of Peace. And believe me, you don't want to go up against this deck. After experiencing just how unfun and downright downright broken this card was, it became clear that being restricted to one copy per deck was the most reasonable solution that wasn't just outright banning the card. Cyberjerk was a card ahead of its time. The card was prone to being far too abusable, and it would usually lead to very unfun and unfair playing conditions. Ideally, this card could have been used as a high risk, high reward type of card that could be used strategically, but in reality, it was far too powerful and only seemed to promote toxic decks to flourish, making duels feel horrendous to play in. All in all, this card fervently deserves its place in the ban list. At one copy per deck, it would be an annoying card to go up against while not letting players be able to pull off hand destruction mill strategies very consistently. So with that, kudos to Konami. That was a great approach to the card, and now we'll move on to the next card on our list. Next up, we have Upstart Goblin. This is a normal spell card which has the effect, draw one card from your deck. Your opponent gains 1,000 life points. So, why did Upstart Goblin get limited? Well, consistency is one of the most important components for any deck to properly function, whether the consistency comes from the ability to search out specific cards or from randomly drawing them. This is why cards that provide the aforementioned consistency always seem to be some of the most played and coveted cards in every format, and to that same extent, always seem to be the first to get some form of restriction. At least, this must have been the same mentality for the limitation of this card. Upstart Goblin is a card which has been on and off the Forbidden and Limited list a few times throughout its history in the game, and for good reason. This card is one of the best generic consistency cards in the game's history. But let's explore just why Upstart was so good. If you played any competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Or maybe have attended a local or two, chances are that you've probably heard players say that a 40 card deck is the most optimal way to build a deck. This is due to the fact that the 40 card deck build allowed for the highest chances of seeing any one specific card, since 40 cards was the absolute minimum amount of cards a deck must run. But you might be thinking to yourself, why is this important to bring up? Well, it's because of the interesting dynamic that Upstart Goblin has. On its own, Upstart Goblin nets you 0 card advantage. But don't let that fool you. Just because you don't go up in card advantage doesn't mean that your deck hasn't become more consistent. The ability to reduce the amount of cards you're forced to play to raise the probability of seeing a card that gets your strategy going is unbelievably strong. It's because of this that I believe Konami decided to just go ahead and limit the cards so soon after release. Also, not to mention that we already had another card in the format that allowed you to draw cards with 0 drawback. But how warranted was this limitation during this period? While I believe that Upstart Goblin is a magnificent consistency card, I also do believe that this card was not broken during the period that it was introduced, and here's why. Magic Ruler format decks were very slow, unlike decks nowadays. Upstart Goblin shines in decks that want to see engine cards to allow their combos to be live, and Magic Ruler didn't have any of those decks available. Also, deck space during Magic Ruler was extraordinarily tight. There was far too many good spell cards that competed for deck space, and if you decided to play a deck that was running more than 40 cards, it would be redundant to play any copies of Upstart Goblin. At that point, it just becomes a useless card, and at that, it gave your opponent more life points to allow them to freely use cards like Confiscation and Delinquent Duo on you. As I said earlier, while I do believe this card's very powerful, I just can't bring myself to think that the limitation was warranted. Upstart Goblin just isn't powerful enough during this period of time to warrant its limitation or a slot in any deck. So all in all, I ultimately disagree with the limitation. Don't get me wrong, I understand that Upstart Goblin being in the game allowed for higher chances of seeing any of your blowout cards like Regeki, Dark Hole, etc. You know them all. I still don't believe that having Upstart Goblin be allowed at 3 would have made any big impact on the format. All in all, I ultimately disagree with the limitation, and I believe that the card was dealt to far too harshly. And furthermore, a more appropriate limitation if they were worried about Upstart could have been to just semi-limit it and go from there. Ultimately, not Konami's best limitation in my opinion. Alright, on to the next one. Next up, we have some of the most frustrating cards to play against: Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry. All 3 are normal spell cards with the following effects, starting with Confiscation. Pay 1000 life points to look at your opponent's hand. Select one card and discard it to the graveyard. Next up, we have Delinquent Duo, which has the effect pay 1000 life points, randomly select and discard one card from your opponent's hand. Your opponent then selects and discards another card from his or her hand. And finally, we have the Forceful Sentry, which has the effect look at your opponent's hand, then select a card and return it to his or her deck. The deck is then shuffled. These cards were the first introduction to a new card theme in the game, the ability to disrupt your opponent's hand advantage. But what made these cards worthy of their status in the Forbidden and Limited list? Well, let's break it down. All three of these cards share one similarity, and that is the ability to have your opponent lose card advantage by losing a card in their hand, but they're all unique in the way they go about it. Confiscation and the Forceful Sentry are both fundamentally different from Duo. Both Confiscation and Sentry provide you insight into your opponent's hand, which is very valuable information, and gives you the ability to get rid of any one problematic card in their hand. As for Delinquent Duo, while this card didn't give you insight to your opponent's hand, it instead provided you extra card advantage by having your opponent lose 2 cards, essentially being a reverse pot of greed. Playing in a format where either player has the ability to see a combination of any of these cards would realistically result in the opposing player just outright losing the game right then and there, just due to the sheer amount of disadvantage they've gone through. Not only because you're starting the turn with significantly less cards, but your opponent now knows exactly what's in your hand and can pretty much play around everything. Honestly, it's kind of insane that Konami decided that it'd be a good idea to release all 3 of these hand disruption cards all in the exact same set. Like, don't get me wrong, I get the idea behind these cards being printed. With the popularity and the power creep that cards like Witch of the Black Forest, Sangan, and Magician of Faith created, there had to be a way to deal with them, since these very powerful cards were extraordinarily difficult to deal with once they were on field. The intention in creating these cards was good, but the execution was done very poorly. That being said, fortunately, they were all limited right away on the ban list. And if for some reason I still haven't made it clear as to why these cards were limited and the issue with having these cards had more than 1 copy per deck, then take a look at this.
Any combination of cards that will automatically win me the game. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Are you ready to go to game 2?
Let's see what I draw for... It's as bad as you think it is. That's where I'm gonna start with things.
Here's the thing. Cards that attack the opponent's hand have a reputation for getting hit on the Forbidden and Limited list, for being far too powerful and creating very toxic and non-enjoyable gameplay. So ultimately, the limiting of these cards was 110% warranted and would have created a horrible game state if they never were, and were allowed to be played at any more quantities. We now move on to arguably one of the most powerful cards to be ever printed in the game's history. Painful Choice is a normal spell card with the following effect. Select 5 cards from your deck and show them to your opponent. Your opponent must select 1 card that will be added to your hand. Discard the remaining cards to the graveyard. In my humble opinion, Painful Choice without a doubt is the most powerful card to be ever printed in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. And honestly, it seems like Konami realized this as well, since Painful Choice went straight to Limited on the October 2002 Banlist. But let's break down why this card was so powerful. First of all, this card gives the player the ability to thin their deck down by 5 cards, and at the same time your opponent is forced to give you one of those 5 cards, which is absolutely ridiculous, as I made it clear with the Upstart section. Also, not only that, but you're then also allowed to utilize the 4 cards sent to the graveyard to extend plays later on. This card was far too powerful and way too prone to being abused, but that wasn't really the case during Magic Rumors, and it wouldn't be the case for a good long while either. During this point in history, the main usage for Painful Choice was either deck thinning, which didn't accomplish much since there was like 0 grave effects that existed, or it could be used as a roundabout way to search any powerful card you really wanted. You could go about this by revealing 5 individually very powerful cards, or by revealing 2 copies of any card and 3 copies of another, essentially forcing forcing your opponent to give you one of those two cards. And finally, the last usage for this card was in sending high-level tribute monsters to the graveyard so that you can later bring back with a card like Monster Reborn. But was this enough for this card to get the limitation that it received? The honest answer is no. It would take a couple of sets before Painful Choice actually became the actual problematic card that it actually is. If anything, it really does seem like Konami was just preemptively hitting the card to prevent it from being as problematic as it would become later on. So do I agree with the limitation or no? Well, while I agree with the limitation of this card when considering just how busted it would become later on, I can't in good conscience say that the limitation was warranted so early on. The card was not good at all during this period of time, and I feel like it would have been a cool tech choice for the formats to see how players could have creatively used it. While one of the most powerful and overpowered banned cards in the game by today's standards, it just wasn't good at the moment. As I mentioned before, there weren't any useful graveyard effects, and Monster Reborn was the only way to recover monsters, and at that the card was limited. Alongside Monster Reborn, we also did have Magician of Faith and Mask of Darkness to recover spell and trap cards, but they were flip monsters, and if your opponent got rid of them in any other way except by battle, you would just never get back those cards. Also, if you take a look at anyone playing this format, you'll notice that no one's using Painful Choice for the reasons that I've stated before. So what's the final verdict on its limitation? Well, I think it was limited far too early, and I truly do believe that it wasn't at risk of affecting the meta in any way, shape, or form. Also, I feel like it would have been genuinely extraordinarily interesting to see how players would utilize the card before the card became a genuine problem in the format. Last up, we have Snatch Steal. Snatch Steal is a normal spell card that reads, take control of one of your opponent's face-up monsters. Your opponent gains 1000 life points for at each of his or her standby phases. This card is among one of the most busted death style cards, being only outclassed by the one and only Change of Heart. I feel like just the fact that it's being compared to Change of Heart, a card that's already been limited on the ban list, is more than enough to understand why this card was limited as well. But let's be diligent and take a closer look at this card. During Magic Ruler format, this card was mostly used as a better soul exchange, or as a means to finish a game, but of course there is a reason why we say that it's outclassed by Change of Heart. Snatch Steal, while a very powerful card, it wasn't overpowered the way Change of Heart was during this period of time. Context is important here. As we mentioned earlier in the video, Searchers and Flip Effect monsters were the best monsters around. These cards didn't really have a high attack stat, making them kind of useless to keep around. Also, Snatch Steal had to target face-up monsters unlike Change of Heart, which had the ability of taking face-down Flip Effect monsters that you could then flip up on your turn and use their effect. On top of that, Snatch Steal had quite a few counters. Mystical Space Typhoon was at 3 and Heavy Storm was at 2. And finally, depending on how long you kept that monster on the field, your opponent would continue to keep gaining life points every turn. As I keep on preaching, life points were more of our resource back in these formats. But even after taking all this into consideration, Snatch Steal was still incredibly powerful, and would also be one of those cards that would see immediate staple play right out of the gate. And also, this card would eventually become more powerful than Change of Heart because of its interactions with cards like Giant Trunade that players hadn't discovered yet, essentially becoming a card that you could infinitely recycle. Even though I just spent the last few minutes pretty much shit-talking Snatch Steal and praising Change of Heart, don't let that fool you. Snatch Steal was very, very powerful and should not be allowed to be played at more than one copy during this format. Keep in mind, even though a card like Regeki is significantly stronger than Dark Hole, both Regeki and Dark Hole were really strong. Same applies here. Even though Change of Heart was better than Snatch Steal was very, very powerful and should not have been slept on. Essentially what I'm trying to say here is that everything that Change of Heart could do, Snatch Steal could do as well. Maybe to a lesser degree, but it could still get the job done. So how warranted was the limitation of Snatch Steal? After taking everything into consideration, I think that it was 100% the right call. As I said before, even though this card was not as powerful as Change of Heart, the card was still incredibly powerful, and honestly, in some cases, Snatch Steal could arguably be better than Change of Heart. But regardless, Konami had the right idea with this limitation. And with that, we've wrapped up the October 2002 ban list. Stay tuned for the next video where we finally wrap up the 2002 year. And if you're still watching, thank you so much for the support, and please consider leaving a like and maybe subscribing for more Yu-Gi-Oh content. Lastly, have you ever played during this period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history? And if so, tell me, do you agree with my assessment of these cards? I'd love to get your feedback, and with all that out of the way, I've been your host, Topsy Turnip. Thank you for the view, and have a wonderful day.